It's the mid-1960s, and the world's greatest superpower battles North Vietnamese communists in a country smaller than the state of Montana. General William Westmoreland, a hard-nosed World War II combat officer, sees the battlefield like a chessboard where armies stand and fight head-on. But unlike chess, Vietnam has no clear objective for Westmoreland to attack.
It's a classic case of a general fighting the last war, and in the sense that the lessons he had learned there only applied partially to Vietnam. There were no fixed objectives to be taken. There were no fixed units to be destroyed.
No one understands this better than North Vietnamese General Vo Nguyen Giap, who sees Vietnam, like Sun Tzu would, as a go-board. Instead of facing the overwhelming U.S. military directly, he uses insurgent forces, the Viet Cong, to stage hit-and-run attacks all over the country.
We see something very similar to Sun Tzu's raids into Chu in North Vietnamese tactics and operations in the Vietnam War.
Giap has learned Sun Tzu's principle that it is more important to outthink your enemy than to outfight him. And it's tactics and strategy, not overwhelming firepower, that causes the U.S. to ultimately lose the war in Vietnam, a loss that Sun Tzu predicted thousands of years earlier. How Sun Tzu was able to do this, as well as predict the outcome of the invasion of Normandy and the final harrowing day of battle at Gettysburg, is about to be revealed. Sun Tzu says, in war, numbers alone confer no advantage. Do not advance relying on sheer military power. It's the mid-1960s in Vietnam. U.S. General William Westmoreland orders intense aerial bombardments. The U.S. will eventually drop nearly 7 million tons of bombs on Indochina during the war, more than twice the tonnage of all the bombs dropped by the U.S. in World War II. But the Americans are about to learn Sun Tzu's lesson the hard way, that despite overwhelming military power and the valor of its soldiers, the U.S. cannot win this war.
Between 1959 and 1975, the North Vietnamese fought a very desperate war against the South Vietnamese government and their U.S. allies. And even though they were heavily outgunned, when you look at how the war was fought and see that through Sun Tzu's eyes, it's obvious how they prevailed.
Westmoreland uses a chess-inspired strategy. Stop the communist spread by killing as many North Vietnamese and Viet Cong as possible. Conversely, Westmoreland's adversary, the North Vietnamese General Vo Nguyen Giap, uses more of a Sun Tzu go strategy.
Westmoreland is trying to attrit the enemy, trying to kill as many as possible. Giap, meanwhile, is looking at it from more of a go perspective, trying to focus on how do I win as much territory as possible and thus defeat my enemy.
To combat the American aerial bombardment, Giap looks to a key Sun Tzu principle. Know your enemy and know yourself, and in 100 battles, you will never be in peril.
The way the Americans often operated was somewhat predictable. They would prepare a landing zone through artillery strikes and airstrikes, and then they would bring the troops in. Giap recognized this and realized that if he could have his troops hunker down and survive the artillery attacks, then when the troops landed, they would be able to set up ambushes to take them on.
The American bombs don't destroy the enemy. They merely telegraph that the U.S. infantry is on its way. Giap also orders his fighters to stay as close to American soldiers as possible.
Viet Cong have no tactical air. They also understand that once their positions get identified in any given battle, they're going to get whacked from the air. So how do you compensate for that? Well, General Giap said you grab the enemy by the belt. Put another way, what you want to do is you don't want to establish positions out there. And when they did defensively, for example, like at Hamburger Hill, you know, wham, they get hit by lots of air. But if you're in a tactical situation, you close with the enemy. You intermingle your forces with his, so they can't bring air power to bear without hurting their own troops.
Free from U.S. bombs, Giap launches Sun Tzu-inspired guerrilla attacks against Americans on the ground. Ambushes, hand grenade booby traps, and snipers.
What Giap starts to do is close-in harassing raids against the Americans. Sun Tzu likes this idea because by forcing the enemy to maneuver, to respond to you, he reveals strengths and weaknesses. And the more you know about his strengths and weaknesses, the more you can avoid the strengths and attack and exploit the weaknesses.
The major U.S. weakness in this war is not on the battlefield.
Now, our weakness was not in Vietnam. We never lost anything in Vietnam. We lost no engagements in Vietnam.